All right, class. First off, as always, good day. I'm glad you're here. So, today is the lesson where we're going to be talking about the immigrants coming to America from the 1870s, 1880s up until the 1900s. But, like I told you guys, we're barely going to talk about the European immigrants because we're really going to be focusing on the Asian immigrants, those that came from China, Japan, Laos, Mongolia, Singapore, even the Philippines and some of that. Um, because the thing is, again, like I mentioned in class, you don't really hear about these guys in the history books. You don't really see movies about what they went through and things like that. So that's again, like I said, I've said it before. That's kind of history that should be taught. That's why I really feel it should be taught. And because again, it's the West Coast. That's our section of the world. Of our country. You're here, so it really affects us. Okay, so let's look at the objectives. So we're analyzing the importance and significance of cultural communities. Some of you guys already know what that is. You may not hear the term cultural communities, but when I explain what it is, you'll probably be like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I went to one of these towns and I saw something like that." You know. And we're examining the difference between European and Asian immigrants, and specifically how they were processed. Even more specific, how much time it took to process them. Okay, so yeah, let's go ahead and get started with your warm up. So here it is. Now, the question is basically asking you, according to this artist, what does this Chinese man, the China man here, the Chinese immigrant, what does he bring to our country? Now, if you notice, he's locked out, right? He's doors are closed, he's left out, and he has some things with him. Okay. So there are four things that this artist says that the Asian immigrants bring with them to our country. Okay. So try to find those four things. And again, if you look at his possessions, you'll see the words. Um, also, think to yourself this when you find all four words, are those things good or are those things bad? Okay. So go ahead, pause the video, write your response because we're moving on in three, two, one. So we're going to start off with the European immigrants. Okay. So again, we're barely going to really barely touch on this. Okay. So one of the main reasons why these European immigrants came to America was jobs. They heard stories about how in the North in America they had a bunch of factories and plenty of jobs, and how people could basically make something out of themselves and they could build a life here in America. All it just took is hard work. And so a lot of people were just like, yeah, that sounds great for me. The next reason why a lot of people came was to escape military service. So a lot of guys came over, young kids, and we're talking their teenage years. The youngest I've ever heard was like 12 years old that they would take guys from their families and put them into the military service of that country. But typically it was like 14, 16 years old, more like 16, where they would basically take the guys and, hey, you're in the military now. You're going to have to serve like so many years, like 4 years or so. Um, so, yeah. So a lot of these guys were like, no, I don't want to be in the military. I don't want to be forced into it. So they left, their family behind and came to America. Another big group or another reason was for religious persecutions. Um, People who were Catholics, unorthodox Jews, um, those who were Muslim and things like that. But the Jewish people, specifically those from Poland and Russia, were deeply, deeply discriminated against. So their only way of not being killed or being harassed on the constant was to come to America. Okay. Now, here's the thing: the European immigrants back in the day, back we're talking about the days of like the Mayflower and that stuff, like stuff like that. Um, those people had to leave their gold and possessions behind. They couldn't take let's say some British gold coins. They couldn't take it. The way the government saw it was, hey, that money belongs to us. It should stay here. You have no use for it out there. You want to leave, leave, but this is staying here. Um, so that old rule was gone now. So if people had money, it's like, yeah, go ahead, leave. Take your money. Um, and also some of the old laws were removed. Like one of the main ones was if you were a skilled worker, let's say you were a stained glass window maker, you were an alchemist or something like that, something that requires skill and training, some of that. They basically said, no, you can't leave. Your country needs you. And it took some people to like sneak out, in order to get away from that country. But now they said, you know what? Yeah, go ahead, leave. Peasants also had to get permission. Basically, the lords and people who was above them would basically tell them, "Did you pay off your debts? You know, pay off your debts first, and then yeah, sure, go ahead. We don't care." You know. But now it's just like, yeah, go ahead, leave if you want. Because again, a lot of times, a lot of places now at this point didn't have peasants because that um, type of system of government was gone. You know. Now, here's another interesting fact. Back in the Mayflower time, they had to rely on the winds, the sails, to take them. And it took them like a month, sometimes up to 2 months, some places, because of weather and the winds and or lack of winds, things like that. Um, they're trying to get away from icebergs and, whatever the case may be. But now, because of steam powered and coal driven engines, um, it took them 2 weeks to go from uh, Europe to America. So it's a lot faster now. Now, most people who were in the boats, they were in the steerage section, which is the bottom of the boat. Um, and it was very cramped, very tight. So if you're like claustrophobic, you don't like people being near you, you would have hated it at that place. The other thing is there was a lot of people got sick because everyone was so close, things like that. Also, you have to remember, like I told the class, the boats were rocking like this back and forth. Imagine 2 weeks of rocking back and forth, back and forth. And if any guy's ever been on a boat or on a train, you know that feeling of being rocking back and forth constantly. It can make people sick. So some people did. They like threw up on the ground and stuff like that. Um, the restrooms weren't that great, and sometimes they got backed up, so people had to go like in buckets, and they had to like toss it overboard. And again, with the rocking, imagine the bucket too, whatever inside might be spilling, and then with the vomit and things like that. And then when these guys left, the crew of the ship they didn't clean the bottom steerage area; they just left it for the next group of people. So yeah, it was pretty bad. So like I said in class, if you look at that picture of that little girl, she's fallen. So chances are in real life she got like an armful of vomit and nastiness all over her. Yeah, wasn't that great. So the immigrants coming from Europe, they went to Ellis Island. Now, if you watch the movie like Godfather 2, they do a fantastic scene where everyone who was in steerage comes up to the top deck to see the Statue of Liberty and stuff like that, and they know we made it. We're here in America. And then they show them go through Ellis Island, the process, and it basically took a day. They basically got people waiting in line. They would ask them, what's your name? Where are you from? And then they would check them for lice, ticks, check to see if they have like cholera, typhoid fever, something. If they were sick, they were put in quarantine, which is another section of the of Ellis Island, and they kept them there till they got better or they passed away. But if everyone was good, then hey, guess what? See you later. Go enjoy New York in America. So it took about a day. So some people did stay in New York. Other people went to other big towns like Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, you know, and they would go there and they'd be like, okay, just wandering around. And then eventually they would find, a section of town that's considered theirs. These were the ethnic communities, the ethnic groups. Basically, took out a part of the city and claimed it as their own. So these type of places became known as like Little Italy, Little Chinatown, Little Tokyo, Little Havana. So if you've ever been to like Chicago, San Francisco, LA, you might find little parts that are called the Little Chinatown, Little Tokyo, Little Tijuana. And that's because that's where a lot of people who are of that ethnic group live there. They have shops there. That way they feel comfortable speaking in their native tongue, buying food from their native land. Um, they were able to recreate churches, because not everyone had a church to go to. Not everyone place had a synagogue or, a Catholic church. You um, the other really cool, interesting thing was the newspapers. These little places, sometimes they would have their own newspapers, and you have to remember, electricity was barely starting to get into gear here. The radio was not even invented yet. Uh, the telephone was just barely invented. So how did they get news from across the sea and some of that? Well, basically, they got letters from home, and they would read like, "Hey, yeah, we were gonna go see your uncle, but there's some fighting going on between these two groups, over there. We were gonna see your grandma, but the town she lives in right near the ocean, there was like a tsunami that went through there." So these guys would then tell the newspaper people, "Oh, I got a letter from home and it's saying this happened and this happened and this happened." So then they would put in the newspaper for everyone to read so that they knew what's happening back home without, like, again, calling somebody or unable to get reading with communications because that didn't exist yet. Okay. So let's go and talk about China now. Okay. So we're going to jump from the East Coast to the West Coast. Now, one of the biggest reasons why people left China was because of the population problem. Okay. Back in the 1880s, it was at about 430 million people. Now, just to give you an idea, here in America, as of 2024, we're at 370 million. This is 140 years before, and we still haven't reached what they had back then. That was a lot of people. And because of that, there was enough jobs for everyone. And because there was no jobs, people couldn't afford food, they couldn't afford homes, so they were homeless, they were starving. Um, So there was enough for everyone. So a lot of times there were people just starving to death on the side of a country road. It wouldn't be surprising if you found people like that, you know. So that was one of the biggest problems and why a lot of people left. The other thing was the gold rush. Okay, back in 1849, gold was discovered, here in California, and some people felt, what, my chances of finding gold is just as good as anyone else in the world. And again, there's so many people here. I can't get a job. Might as well try my luck. So they left. The other big one was the Taiping Rebellion. Um, this was basically the peasant people going against the upper level, the lords and stuff like that, the noblemen. And fighting just happened sporadically everywhere, things like that. It wasn't just like one place and it moved. No, it was sporadic. And some people got caught in the crossfire, wrong place, wrong time. We call it now collateral damage, but innocent people got killed. So some people were just like, forget this, I'm going to leave. Now, once the Chinese people came to America, the only job a lot of them could get was working the railroads. You know, we talked about the Union Pacific Railroad going from West Coast towards the East. So a lot of them did that, because that was the only job they can get. And in some places like San Francisco and surrounding towns, Chinese people tried to basically live a life and they were discriminated against. At some stores, they basically were told, "We don't allow your kind here." They would tell them, "We don't want your kind." So what they did is they were forced basically to make their own stores, make their own shops, grocery stores, and laundry mats and things like that. And they did the smart thing in this sense. They could have easily gone down that same path as the other people, the white people and stuff like that, and go, you know what? We don't want your kind. We don't want your kind in our store. We don't provide service for your kind. No, 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 no. What they did was basically said, we accept everyone. Come on in. We don't care if you're, you know, white, black, Latin, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. Come on in. And because of that, because they didn't discriminate, they got a lot of business. And because they got a lot of business, they were able to make the prices go down a little bit because they were getting income, right? And that made them successful. People started coming, really started shopping at their places, and they made more money. So that was a smart thing that they did. And like I said, they could have easily said, no, we don't want your kind, but they didn't. So the Japanese people, now these guys were a minority when it came to coming over to America, um, from the 1880s to the 1900s. But from 1900 to 1908, that changed because a lot of them were coming over because the Russo-Japanese War was happening during this time. So some people were like, you know what, I don't want to fight the Russians, so I'm going to go to America, and that's what some of them did. Okay. Now, from the 1800s up to 1910, people were processed at the pier in San Francisco in this wharf, or sorry, on the wharf in this two-story shed, and they could fit like about 500 people inside. But as time went on and more people started coming, and they took a long time to process the Asian immigrants. They basically were like, okay, we need some place else to put these guys. So they looked around. They go, well, what about Alcatraz? Well, it was a Civil War fort. Now it's going to be a prison. So, how about that island over there, right next to it? And that became Angel Island. That was Angel Island. So that became the housing unit for the immigrants. Okay, and a lot of these guys coming over were teenagers, early 20s. There were some girls, but a lot of them were men. Okay, or guys. And like I said, the process time it took for them to get their name down, where are you from, and all that stuff, um, and to check them and things like that, it took months. Months. Now, this is something a student asked me yesterday. Well, did it really have to be like months? Could they not understand them, or what's going on? And it's like, no, because it was more discrimination. Because again, those people who were doing the process stuff, they knew they didn't have to let these guys in. They knew they can just make them suffer being on this island. They can't go anywhere, you know, and just keep them there. And that's what they did. They make their lives hell. And it took months for these guys to go through the process. It was so bad that some of these Chinese and Japanese guys wrote poetry, carved it into the wood, you know, of the shacks and things like that on Angel Island, and they're still there to this day. You could actually read them. Now, this is one of the darker stains in our history. It's called the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Basically, it barred Chinese immigrants from coming into this United States for 10 years. And on top of that, any Chinese person who was already a citizen or who was already here, they're now stripped of that citizen title. So they can't be citizens. They're not recognized as citizens. If anything, they're probably seen as like a refugee, you know? So, yeah, it was really, really bad. The Chinese people were just like, well, why us? You know? Oh, and before I begin, or move on, I forgot to mention this. You have to remember this, guys. People who are racist, they don't see like, oh, you're Chinese, you're Japanese, you're Laos, you're this. No, all they see is, oh, you look like this, so you have to be Chinese. You know, it's the same thing with how racist people see Latinos. They don't see them as, oh, you're Cuban, you're Puerto Rican, you're Dominican, you're Mexican, you're Colombian, you're Uruguayan. No, you're all Mexicans. You know, again, so again, yeah, that's what you have to remember. The Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't just specifically for Chinese, it was for all Asians. Because again, racist people don't see the distinction of the difference of the people. They just see, oh, you guys are all in that same group. Okay. So with that being said, the Chinese people were like, well, how come you're picking on us? Why us? And they were basically told, well, there's a lot of you guys. There's a ton of you guys. You guys are everywhere. We're trying to limit how much your people come in this country. And the Chinese people are like, are you kidding? There are more Italians. There are more Germans. There are more Irish people in this country than there are us. No, 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 no. No, you don't know what you're talking about. No, there's more of you guys than all those groups. Okay. So what these Chinese immigrants and Chinese people um, tried to do was they tried to petition the government, especially the president, and tell him, "Hey, what's up? What's all this about? Things like that. This isn't fair. This isn't right." The president basically turned his back on them, right? So the next thing they figured was, well, let's sue them. They can't do this. This is not right. It goes against our rights and things like that. Here is the problem. Under the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was already passed, two things happen. One, because they're no longer citizens, they no longer have rights as citizens. Okay. The second thing is they can't sue the government because, again, they're not citizens of this country. Okay. So that's the problem that they're facing. They can't do anything. And that's, again, the like evil genius of that plan, of that act, was to strip them of their citizenship so they can't sue. They can't rely on the rights of the Constitution guarantees them as citizens because they're not citizens. Okay. Now, in 1892, 10 years have passed. So some Chinese people were like, okay, well, you know what? 10 years have passed. They probably realize now this new Congress will realize, hey, these are okay people. They're good people. You know, they do their jobs here, and, we should just let this thing die. No, that Congress renewed it for another 10 years. So 1902 comes along, and, some Chinese people were like, you know what? 20 years have passed, they'll realize, hey, we made a mistake. These are hardworking people. They should be counted as citizens. This whole Exclusion Act is wrong and horrible. No, that Congress made it permanent. So for the next 10 years after that, the Chinese population dwindled by 30%. Now, this continued up until 1943 when it was repealed. And for those of you guys who are pretty knowledgeable in world history, you would know that in 1943 we were in World War II, and it's because Japan bombed the United States, and the United States realized that, hey, China and Japan are enemies; they hate each other. The United States tried to basically go to them and say, hey, we should work together, we should do this and that, and go against Japan. And the Chinese government, the Chinese people are like, why? Why should we join you? Why should we listen to you? There are people, our ancestors, our cousins, our family members, who been living there for almost 100 years. Some people there for almost 100 years, and you don't count them as citizens. You don't see them as equal. You don't see them as people. So why? So it's really because of that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. Okay, it wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts. Is because basically they needed something from China. They found that they had a common enemy in Japan, and they needed help. Now, nativist or nativism, these are what I call the Karens of the basically early 1900s, 1880s, somewhere around that area. These were the people who really didn't like the Asian immigrants, the Jewish immigrants, immigrants coming from the eastern part of Europe, the Latino immigrants. They basically felt like the old immigrants were good for America, you know, and the new immigrants were just a burden on America. They just take, they never give type of stuff. So this is the argument they would give, like wealth, money. They would say the old immigrants, oh, these guys came with money. They knew how to use money. They made America richer. Whereas the new immigrants, ugh, they take from our country. They're poor. They do nothing for us. They just take, and we have to pay and pay. Does that sound familiar? When it comes to education, they're like, oh, these old immigrants were so smart. They spoke English. They wrote in English. They were so intelligent. Whereas the new immigrants, oh, they're so poor. They're so dumb. They can't read English. They can't write it. It's not that hard. Why can't they do it? It's like they don't want to. Does that sound familiar? And one of the bigger ones is the religion. The old immigrants were good, Christian, clean people. Whereas these new immigrants, they're Catholics, they're Jewish, they're Muslim, they're, Buddhists. They're anything but Christian. And, they're just, oh, they just worship their idols and they're just horrible people because they don't believe what I believe. Does that sound familiar? Because if not, you haven't been paying attention to what's been going on in this country for the past 140 years. Because these are the same arguments people have been saying to this day about immigrants. It's the same argument, the same thing they've been saying. Their song has not changed at all. Okay. And one of my favorite stats, if you look at this picture, this is why I love showing it. Because remember, they said the old immigrants were good for America, and there wasn't that many of them. And America's being taken over by all these immigrants. These new immigrants coming over. But if you look at the numbers, the old immigrants, if you look on top where it says Europe, um, that was 7 million people. Now, if you take the southern route, the bottom part of Europe, take that number, Latinos, and the Asians, you add up those numbers, you barely get 3.5 million people. That's less than half of the 7.8 million uh, old immigrants that came over. But yet, no, no, those people, those new immigrants are taking over this country, and oh, they're just everywhere. So those people who make those arguments, they don't know what they're talking about, and they're just, in a sense, kind of really making things up. So here's my question to you. Why do you think the Asian American people history isn't told as much as their European counterparts? How come you see, in history books about the Irish and the Scottish and the French and the English, and the Italians, how they came over and things like that. And then there's like movies. There's like again like The Godfather 2. There's like even Five Goes West. Movies like Far and Away, talking about the Irish and stuff like that. How come you never see any movie about the Asian immigrants coming over during that time? I've never seen them, and I love movies, especially older movies till now, and I have yet to see one. So, like I told the other classes, if you find one, let me know so I can watch that movie. You know, but I have yet to see one. So, why do you think again their history is not mentioned, isn't shown, isn't talked about? Okay, so go ahead, write your response. All right. Once you finish that, though, you're done with this lesson. So hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Okay. So with that being said, guys, you take care, you be safe, and I'll see you guys later, right?